Okay, friends, I'm going to try to get through John chapter 2, hopefully without my dogs doing anything weird in the background. If they do something weird in the background, I don't know what to tell you. Jesus created them, so have grace for him. John chapter 2. Jesus changes water into wine. Now, as we discussed, um, a lot of the stories in John don't appear in the other Gospels. John was written later because he references the Synoptic Gospels. And also, an interesting fact is that Jesus on the cross asked John to take care of his mom. So we know that Mary lived with John after Jesus died. So a lot of these stories might have came from Mary. That might be why so many of them are focused around women. Because Mary obviously was there when some of the disciples were not. So, but anyway, John chapter 2. Jesus changes the water into wine. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. So Cana in Galilee is at the foot of Mount Carmel. According to Josephus, in his writings, this was a zealot village, which makes sense because if you're a zealot, if you're an assassin, if you want to drive the Romans out by force, then your two heroes are Judah Maccabee, who led, that's the Hanukkah story, and Elijah the prophet, who stood strong against a corrupt king and who slew the prophets of Baal and called down fire from heaven. So, it took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." Woman. This is not like we would say woman in the South. This is more of a term of endearment and respect. But, woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." So, we've talked a little bit about Peshat, Remez, Drosh, and Sod. And one thing we know about Mary from the other Gospels is the Magnificat, the song that she sings when she finds out about her being pregnant with Jesus, is like soaked in Scripture. Mary very clearly knows her text. So, on the Peshat level, it looks like Jesus is like, "Hey, Mom, it's not time for me to show myself yet." And it's almost like Mary ignores him and looks at the servants and goes, "Hey, just do whatever he tells you to do." But on a Remez level, we have to look at the statements that they make, right? So, the first statement that Jesus says is, "My time has not yet come." Now, if you look in Scripture, that phrase in a wedding, where have we seen that before? Well, we see it in Genesis chapter 29, verse 21, actually right before a wedding. This is the story of Jacob, the deceiver, the trickster, when he goes to work for his uncle Laban. He works all this time for Rachel. And he works for 7 years for Laban, and then he comes to Laban, and what he says is, "Give me my wife, my time is completed." So, in this instance, Jacob is saying, "My time has come, give me my wife." But what Jesus is saying is the opposite. He's saying, "My time has not yet come." Okay? Why, in this context, would Jesus be saying that? Well, we know, looking at Jesus' teaching, that Jesus does not jive with a zealot worldview. Could it be, and this is just conjecture because we don't know for sure, could it be Jesus telling his mom, look, I'm not marrying myself to these people. But what Mary comes back with is looking at the servants and going, do whatever he tells you to do. Which we also see in Genesis. Not in this story, not in the Jacob and Laban story, but in Genesis 41, chapter 55. We see Joseph is before Pharaoh and has just interpreted his dream for him. And it says in verse 55, when all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told the Egyptians, go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you to do. So you could be saying that Jesus is making the argument of, Mom, these people don't do things the way that I agree with, so I'm not marrying myself to them. However, Mary might be saying, well, Jesus, when Joseph was in Egypt, the Egyptians didn't do things the way that Joseph did them, and Joseph saved them anyway. Is this really what's going on? Maybe. It's definitely something to think about. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. So this is more Elijah imagery. Think about him on top of Mount Carmel, and what does he ask after he chops up the bull and puts it on the altar? He says, come bring water and pour it on it, right? Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. They did so, and as the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine, he did not realize where it had come from. Then, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best wine till now. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. There they stayed for a few days. All right. Making sure I didn't forget anything. Also, dude, let's camp out on this this for a little bit. So Mary is at this wedding, this zealot wedding. We don't know of the 5 kind of like political persuasions where Jesus' family fell, but we do know Mary was at a zealot wedding. Joseph says he was a carpenter, but a carpenter is like a carpenter and a stonemason or whatever. And we do know that there was a stone quarry owned by Herod right outside of Nazareth. 3, Jesus, in a lot of in the Gospels, quotes stuff from Greek plays. So since Joseph probably worked in the stone quarry outside of Nazareth, and Jesus obviously knows about Greek culture, was Joseph Herodian and Mary a zealot? Don't know. History doesn't tell us. We can only guess. But it's something interesting to think about. Jesus clears the temple courts. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So, a couple things here. There were people sitting at tables exchanging money because of the law in the 10 Commandments. It says you can't have a graven image. You cannot have coins bearing the image of the emperor after the court of the Gentiles. So, we know that this is most likely set up in the Gentile court. It also mentions that people were selling doves and lambs. What the Sadducees would do to line their own pockets is when people would bring their sacrifices to the temple, by the time they got into the court of the Gentiles, they've already been through quite a few things. What the Sadducees would do was you get there with your sacrifice, they'd examine it, they'd say, "Nah, this doesn't meet the requirements we have, but we have animals you can buy here. You can leave this one with us and buy a new one." In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get out! Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So what's going on here? Well, once again, John is kind of weird with time. Because in all the other Gospels, Jesus clears the temple that last week of his life when he's in Jerusalem. But John puts it super early. Like, really early. Okay? So, the question is, did Jesus cleanse the temple twice or just once? If he cleanses it twice, there is a textual reference for it. And that is in Leviticus chapter 14. So let's go back to Leviticus. I bet none of y'all thought we were going to read from Leviticus today. So Leviticus 14, starting in verse 33. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When you enter the land of Canaan, which I am giving you as a possession, and I put a spreading mold in a house in that land, the owner of the house must go and tell the priest, 'I have seen something that looks like a defiling mold in my house.' The priest is to order the house to be empty before he goes in to examine the mold, so that nothing in the house will be pronounced unclean. After this, the priest is to go in and inspect the house. He is to examine the mold on the walls, and if it has a greenish or reddish depression that appear to be deeper than the surface of the wall, the priest shall go out the doorway of the house and close it up for 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest shall return to inspect the house. If the mold has spread on the walls, he is to order that the contaminated stones be torn out and thrown into an unclean place outside of town. He must have all the inside walls of the house scraped, and the material that is scraped off dumped into an unclean place outside of town. Then they are to take the other stones to replace these and take new clay, and plaster the house." So if he does clean the temple twice, it's like this law from Leviticus. Because we know not too long after Jesus resurrects and ascends that Rome will come in and literally take the temple apart stone by stone and throw them in the valley of Gehenna right there. Well, let's talk about this phrase, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." This term market is unique. It shows up in Zechariah chapter 14. Which I'm going to have a minute finding because a minor prophet is kind of hard to find. Y'all just talk amongst yourselves. Oh, excuse me. Zechariah 14. Ah, yes. This is verse 20 through 21. "On that day, holy to the Lord will be inscribed on the bells of the horses, and the cooking pots in the Lord's house will be like the sacred bowls in front of the altar. Every pot in Jerusalem and Judah will be holy to the Lord Almighty. And all who come to sacrifice will take some of the pots and cook in them. And on that day there will no longer be," in my translation it says, "a Canaanite." I think a better translation is even got a footnote in my Bible, is "a merchant in the house of the Lord Almighty." So, his disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The next line, verse 18, the Jews, this word is idui, which means Judeans. Usually when you see the term Jews, it doesn't refer to just the Jewish people. It means the people from the region of Judea, like people from Jerusalem. The Judeans then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his own body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said, and then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Now, remember his Passover. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He did not need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what was in each person. All right, guys. That's it for John chapter 2. Great job. Expect the videos for 3, 4, and 5 to drop soon. And yeah, thank you guys for your time. Love getting to study the Bible with y'all.